Dragon has been working with Vegapunk this entire time. This confirmation, along with new hints about Kuma's race and history, could explain the entire story of how Kuma lost his kingdom and daughter, but then came up with a plan with revolutionary leaders Vegapunk and Dragon to get his revenge and then some. Buckle up, cause it's gonna be a ride. And where we start is actually from Jinbei, who does a bit of a lore dump in this chapter, but at the same time, he's kinda just like roasting Bonnie's dad in front of her face. But from Jinbei, we get a TLDR of Kuma's story, how he was a tyrant king of the Sorbet Kingdom, which was something we already knew from Viva cards. What we didn't know is that Kuma was disposed of by his own people and forced to become a pirate. And this is where we get to our first mystery, because the idea of Kuma being a tyrant king, that's completely contradictory to his nature that we've seen in the story. Just a couple of chapters ago, we saw him in a flashback where he was a kind-hearted father smiling with Bonnie. He just looked like a nice dad that'd be cracking dad jokes and watching baseball. But to further confirm Kuma's true nature, we also heard from Sabo that he was a kind-hearted person. And Sabo only met him 14 years ago when he was already an officer of the Revolutionary Army. So there's a clear contradiction here, which leads me to believe that the world government got involved and completely twisted his image just like they did with Robin. But the important question is, what was the reason that they did that? And luckily, we might have just gotten the answer from Bonnie in this chapter. Because it turns out Kuma is a special race, and that could be the key on why the world government took action against him and Bonnie. Because as we've seen throughout the story, the world government is no stranger to persecuting special races for their powers. The Lunarians were pretty much entirely wiped out, with just some of them being used for experiments like King. Kaido, who's part of the Oni race that we still don't know too much about, was experimented on as well. And then there's a three-eyed tribe that can awaken the ability to read poneglyphs, and coincidentally, we've only seen one of them in the story. So any special races that pose as a threat to the world government, they will not hesitate to take them down, and Kuma could be no different. What exactly is Kuma's special race?
I have no idea!
Either way though, I do think it's incredibly likely that Kuma was taken down by the world government because of his race, and the key hint could be this image from his childhood. Because in this image, he just looks like a poor young peasant, definitely not someone who would become king. So could it be possible that he escaped the persecution of his race as a kid, and then in the Sorbet Kingdom rose his way to the top as a kind-hearted king? I think it's very likely, especially as one Reddit post pointed out, there's potentially a massive hint with the book that he's holding in this picture named Nino Kent, because that means he's possibly inspired by the Japanese historical figure Ninomiya Sontoku, who was someone that was born in a poor peasant family but worked his way up to running provinces. And that could have been Kuma's story until the world government found out the truth about his race and decided to put him out of power. This of course led him to hating the world government, which we already knew about from Ivankov, but it gets reconfirmed in this chapter from Bonnie. But that's also not the only reason he would hate the world government, because his daughter Bonnie was eventually captured by them, and she was so much of a threat to the world government that when Akainu found out that she escaped, he said he had a cold shiver run down his spine. That right there feels like a very out of character thing for Akainu to say, so what exactly could make him act that way? Well, as we know, he's all about absolute justice. He wants to have control and power to really rule everybody. At the tragedy of Ohara, he even went as far to kill the citizens. So what if the daughter of a tyrant king that's part of a unique race who poses a threat to the world government escaped without him knowing? I think that's the type of stuff that actually worries Akainu, him losing control of something. And that would also explain the tragedy of Bonnie and Kuma and how the world government took them down. But this is where Dragon and Vegapunk come in, because with the blanks starting to get filled in, we can uncover Kuma's story and how he worked with both of them to free Bonnie. You see, just a couple of chapters ago, we found out that Vegapunk and Kuma knew each other when Bonnie was just a kid. And here's where things could get a little confusing, because there are multiple potential timelines because of how Bonnie's fruit works. And because of the way she's been acting in the recent chapters of calling Kuma daddy and being really emotional, some people think she might actually still be a kid. And this idea really intrigued me at first, but after thinking about it for a while, I just don't think it makes sense. Because throughout the story, she's done a lot of complicated actions, from escaping from the world government government to infiltrating Marijois. It's a lot of difficult things that you can't really expect a little kid to do. So overall, I just don't think it makes that much sense for Bonnie to still be a kid, especially because when we use the timeline of Bonnie being an adult, we can pretty much explain the actions of every character. Because assuming Bonnie is an adult, her Viva card estimates her to be 24 years old. And given that information, it would mean that Kuma knew Vegapunk about 20-something years ago. And this is where it gets interesting, because if this is the correct timeline, by then Vegapunk was already working for the world government. And the reason we know that is because of Kaido. He's the X factor that fills in the gaps. Because as we know, Vegapunk as part of the world government experimented on Kaido and King. And timeline wise, we know that Kaido started his crew 33 years ago, which means by then he must have already escaped. And to confirm that even more, 28 years ago is when he met with Kurozumi Higurashi, and in that scene we see King next to him all grown up. So considering that information, we know that around 20 years ago when Vegapunk met Kuma, he was already working with the world government, which is really interesting because in the flashback, Kuma still seems like a happy guy that still has his daughter. So I'm guessing at that point, he's still the king of the Sorbet Kingdom, a kind-hearted, happy man, and he also might have not yet despised the world government because he already was working and talking with Vegapunk, who was already part of the world government. Eventually though, things go south. He ends up getting labeled as a tyrant king, kicked out of his kingdom, becomes a pirate, he loses his daughter to the world government, so he then at some point ends up joining the Revolutionary Army at least 14 years ago, and as we find out in the latest chapter, he ends up getting caught by the world government and is sentenced to life. But he ends up getting a lifeline because lo and behold, Vegapunk is interested in him. And Kuma, despite hating the world government, becomes a warlord and gives himself up for the Pacifista project, which Bonnie correctly pointed out in this last chapter doesn't make any sense unless he got something in return. And that he definitely did, because not only have we known since Marineford that Dragon knew about Vegapunk and Kuma's deal, but it's now also clear that Vegapunk is working with Dragon, which also explains why despite still being a cyborg, Kuma's following Dragon's orders after he got rescued. So the first benefit that Kuma got out of this deal is clearly infiltration. Him, Dragon, and Vegapunk worked out a plan to benefit all sides, which on the revolutionaries end has to be at least getting information, but could be even deeper, like getting control of the pacifistas. It was even recently noted that the Kuma Seraphim is a bit of a problem child, so Dragon and Kuma are definitely getting something out of this deal to benefit the revolutionaries. But there's another piece to this, because as Kuma becomes a warlord, his daughter magically escapes and starts her pirate journey as a super rookie of the worst generation. Coincidence? I think not. Instead, I think the second part of this deal was to help Kuma free his daughter, which is why he was willing to sacrifice himself. Now, of course, as indicated in the most recent chapter, Bonnie seems to have no idea about any of this, which is why she became a pirate to look for Vegapunk. But speaking of Vegapunk, what does this mean for his story? Well, at the very least, he's definitely working with Dragon currently, so I think it's incredibly likely that he is a revolutionary. And if that is the case, there's a lot more blanks that could be filled. Maybe this whole time he was undercover. He could have been a revolutionary even before Kuma, and maybe he was the one to introduce Dragon to Kuma. It's also important to note that Bonnie said that Egghead Island just had a very small lab when she visited as a kid, but at that point, Vegapunk was already working with the world government and had a huge lab in Punk Hazard. So the fact that he's meeting with Kuma in this small lab on Egghead feels like it might be a little secretive, something he's keeping away from the world government, which once again would back the idea that he's been undercover this whole time. So when it came time for Kuma and Dragon to carry out their plan, Vegapunk was right there already on the inside. Motivation wise, I think it makes a lot of sense for his character as well. One thing I've been consistently pushing even after we met Vegapunk is that I think Vegapunk is at heart a good person. Time and time again, we've seen Vegapunk invent things to try to help people, and even some of his negative satellites like Evil, they're still pretty chill at the end of the day and really just trying to innovate for a better future as their ultimate goal. And also historically, when you think about the formation of the world government and how they defeated the Great Kingdom, a kingdom that was so technologically advanced, whose side do you think Vegapunk would be on? Either way though, with the world government ready to take Vegapunk out and him still currently working with Dragon, I do think Dragon will end up gaining a lot out of this mission, from pacifistas to technology to information. And also I can't wait to see Vegapunk tell Luffy about his dad, him not caring at all, but us being absolutely hyped. But that's it for this video. Subscribe and peace!